The Physical History of the Earth by Swiss geologist Andre De Luc, first published in 1798. Section 2. The following fundamental point in geology has been established by De Luc with undoubted success when, he says, we have studied the continents with attention in all their parts, from their centers to their borders, from their greatest elevations to their lowest depths, when we have seen the regularity of the strata composing the whole of their observable mass, and the quantity of the marine bodies contained in those strata, it is impossible not to acknowledge that we are inhabiting an ancient bed of the sea. But that a comparatively short period of time has elapsed since the retreat of the ocean from our present tracts of lands, is a position which by some naturalists has been contested. Several slow causes of a gradual retreat from its former bed had been imagined, but by continued observations of terrestrial phenomena, the author was enabled to demonstrate in the above-mentioned work that all such slow causes were purely imaginary. The following is the nature of the proofs by which, on the other hand, he was led, in the study of the earth, to infer the recent origin of our continents. If, he says, they are of small antiquity, all the classes of phenomena which indicate a succession, and which appear to date their origin from the existence of the new lands, are to be traced back to the same period with as much exactness, at least, in respect both to the data and calculations, as regard to the nature of the objects can require. Now, it is from such different classes of phenomena that he has succeeded in establishing, with the precision of which the subject could scarcely be deemed susceptible, a well-defined physical chronology of the earth, by means of what he has termed natural chronometers. It is from the documents of nature, and not from those of history, that he has deduced the chronology of our continents, and that of the human race. From the period of the retreat of the sea from our lands, they have been subjected to a series of operations which are of such a nature as to leave monuments of their progress from certain points at which it is evident that they must have commenced. Their action still continues and is carried on before our eyes. Every natural object upon our continents, he says, is a chronometer, and that, from the same general cause, viz., that every object which was liable to undergo a change, by reason of the state in which it then was, and in consequence of the action of physical or mechanical causes, began at that time to suffer such a change. We are thus supplied with an infallible guide in the history of the earth, through which we are conducted by unquestionable monuments. Wheresoever, by any perceptible cause, some part of our continents has suffered a change since the time at which they emerged from the sea, we can discern what was its particular state at that period, and whilst we are enabled to ascertain the total change, we find portions produced within known times. The operations of those causes have been ascertained by the enlightened author of the present work with singular ingenuity and success. All their products and effects are capable of measurement. They are absolutely distinct and independent of each other, having nothing in common but the point of their commencement, yet, however different in their nature, they all led to the same conclusion, impossibility of carrying back the origin of our continents to a period more remote than that which the Mosaic chronology has assigned to the deluge. Various classes of these chronometers are minutely described in the author's letters on the physical history of the earth in the Physics Journal and in his travels as resulting from numerous phenomena, such as the collection of vegetable earth produced by the decomposition of plants on uncultivated soils, the natural history of peat mosses, the extension of snow and ice on high mountains, the accumulations of fallen materials under the abrupt sides of mountains and at the foot of steep coasts, the reduction of cliffs into grassy slopes, alluvial lands formed by rivers along their course, maritime new lands, We are here presented with chronometers all possessing the same conditions, and consisting of effects resulting from known causes which can have been in operation only since the continents have existed, and of which the progress within known times is indicated by indisputable monuments. Moreover, the completion of several of these effects has been pointed out by the author in a variety of places. For the purpose of here further manifesting the nature of geological chronometers, as traced by De Luc, some of those just mentioned may be selected for remark. Gravity, and the action of the rains, and other atmospherical causes have a continual tendency to crumble down and reduce the abrupt sections of mountains, as well in valleys, as towards the plains. The detached fragments are accumulated at their feet, and rise against them with that kind of slope, which, in fortification, is called a talus, being formed by materials rolling down over each other from a certain point, and preventing the farther demolition of the parts which they thus have covered. The gradual progress of this general operation is clearly discernible by the progress of vegetation. Now, if an antiquity without any assignable limits is to be ascribed to our continents, such operations must long since have been everywhere terminated, and the surface of the slopes would be found entirely overspread with plants and verdure. But, remarks De Luc, the operation continues different stages, which depend on the original state of each individual part, and on the nature of its strata. To the gradual softening of its slopes, is the valley of Campan indebted for being one of the most delightful retreats of pastoral life. It was once a deep ravine, but the debris of the summits that command it have raised the bottom of those precipices. The waters have had a constant tendency to level the soil in their course. The process of crumbling down has been continued. Rest has succeeded to long convulsions, and vegetation has covered those heaps of ruins now fitted for its reception. The valley of Campan may then be regarded as presenting by anticipation that appearance of repose described by De Luc, who has foreseen what mankind are to expect in regard to the perfectibility of our continents. Such will be all the valleys of the Pyrenees and the Alps, of Caucasus, of Atlas and the Andes. Further, it has been rendered evident by De Luc that the action of the sea has a tendency to efface the original indentations of coasts by diminishing the promontories, filling up creeks and bays, and reducing cliffs to gentle declivities. These simultaneous operations on the same coasts must have commenced as soon as the ocean retired into its present bed. They continue, and by the effects produced compared with their measurable progress, necessarily constitute a direct chronometer. Accordingly, all the lands formed by the sea upon its shores are everywhere distinct in their composition from those to which they are joined. They are horizontal from the point of junction to their actual extremity, and continue to increase. Now, from the known progress of these lands, compared with their total extent, it is manifest that the sea cannot have occupied its present bed during a very great number of centuries. Again, at the entrance of lakes, the progress of the accumulation of the sediments of rivers affords another striking chronometer of the same kind, and in every such place, the dates at which possession was taken of new grounds, and embankments were opposed to the swell of streams, are ascertained. The fifth letter in the present collection likewise exhibits a masterly view of the several chronometers with which our continents supply us. Those which are formed by the progress of agriculture, and the various stages of cultivation, will excite peculiar interest, as affording one of the proofs of the small antiquity of the human race upon our present lands. In that letter he says, the evident history of the cultivators of our land comes in as a support to those facts that relate to spontaneous vegetation, to set aside the fabulous pretensions of some nations to antiquity, since it follows equally from both, that our continents themselves can have no higher date than the deluge described by Moses. the celebrated naturalists Dogma and Eshar acquiesced in the various proofs thus adduced by De Luc of the recent origin of our continents, and supported them by new facts resulting from their own observations. "I shall defend," says the former, in his memoir Another Truth, "which appears to me incontestable, and which the works of De Luc have rendered evident to me, a truth of which I see the proof in every page of the history of man, and in all those wherein the phenomena of nature are recorded." With De Luc, I shall say that the actual state of our continents is not ancient. With him I think that but a short period of time has elapsed since they were delivered up to the dominion of man. And Eshar, in the second volume of the work, Trips in the Alps, speaking of the glaciers Debois, in the valley of Chamouni, situated on the opposite side of the central chain, expresses himself as follows: "The blocks of stone with which the bottom of this glacier is loaded lead to an important reflection. When we consider the smallness of their number, and recollect that they are deposited at this extremity of the glacier in proportion as the ice melts, we are astonished that there is not a more considerable heap. And this observation, as it agrees with many others which I shall report in succession, may induce us to believe, with De Luc, that the present state of our continents is not so ancient as some philosophers have supposed it to be." This important truth is also acknowledged, and upon similar grounds, by Mr. Alex Brongniart in his work, Treatise on the Terrain. While allowing to Dr. Buckland all the praise which is due to the geologist as a judicious and enlightened observer, it would be an act of great injustice to De Luc to withhold from him the exclusive merit of having been the first to point out those chronological monuments in the physical history of the earth, afforded by the various operations which are taking place on our continents. Nor can it fail to excite some surprise that his name should have been passed over in silence by the professor, when deducing the same inferences from these phenomena, and repeating the same observations which had been made with the utmost accuracy and care by that illustrious geologist, upwards of 45 years before the publication of the Reliquiae Diluvianae. If Professor Buckland deemed it right to mention in honourable terms the observations of Baron Georges Cuvier, much more does it seem to have incumbent on him not to forget the naturalist who had so successfully preceded the latter in the same researches. In regard to that part of the professor's work, in which the interchange of sea and land, at the period of the deluge, is denied by him to have taken place, the editor has been favoured with some observations by Mr. J. Andre De Luc, of which the following is the substance. The mode, Mr. J. Andre De Luc observes, in which the professor conceives the deluge to have taken place, appears inadmissible. He does not inform us by what means the ocean was expelled from its bed, so as to occasion the deluge, nor what causes determine the retreat of the waters into their former basin. In maintaining the fact of an universal deluge which should have reached the summits of the highest mountains of the present continents, he takes no account of the fate of the plants and animals which must necessarily have all perished. He does not inform us how the earth, after this revolution, was without the history of the new lands of the Meuse, the Rhine, the Issel, the Ems, the Weser, the Ost, and the Elbe, who has distinctly marked out the line where the alluvial soil comes into contact with the continental soil, called in Germany Geest, who has given a detailed history of the first settlements on those new lands, as they were gradually forming. The authors who have followed or copied De Luc have in fact done little more than confirm his inferences or results by similar observations carried on at the mouths of other rivers, such as the Po, the Adige, the Garonne. He does not inform on how Earth was repeopled with organized beings, since those which now inhabit the Earth are not the descendants of its antediluvian inhabitants, with the exception of domestic animals and the seeds of plants preserved in the ark by Noah. neither does he at all advert to the influence which the atmosphere must have exercised in connection with the phenomena of the deluge. It would appear that at that period a great portion of the atmosphere was resolved into water, and it is to those superior waters that must be ascribed a part of the devastations produced on the Earth's surface. Professor Buckland cannot readily get over the argument drawn from the absence of all human remains from among the fossil bones of terrestrial antediluvian animals, an argument confirmed by Cuvier in his 1825 work, Research on Fossil Bones, and which proves that the lands now occupied by the human race are not the same with those which it inhabited before the deluge, and that these last are now beneath the waters of the ocean. This argument bears with it such weight that it is not easily conceivable how the professor could pass it over so slightly. He ascribes a great deal too much to the action of the waters of the flood. How can he imagine that an inundation, sudden, simultaneous, universal, and transient, such as he describes, can have excavated the transversal valleys? It is not a simple passage of waters that can have produced such astonishing effects. A cause is wanting which had been already considered necessary by the late Mr. Eshar of Zurich, who has so carefully observed the Alps. Let us advert to this geologist's assertions respecting the transversal valleys of the chain. If those valleys, he says, and the mountains which border them, are considered with attention, the following remarks, in general, will occur. Those valleys intersect the longitudinal chains, and the longitudinal valleys at angles more or less obtuse, frequently even at right angles, and the masses which are on each side of those intersections exactly correspond in the direction and inclination of their strata, insomuch that the valleys exhibit the appearance of breaches made, by some subsequent cause, in the strata, originally continuous, of the great chains. The intermediate mass which previously occupied the vacancy was destroyed and carried away, at a time when the mountains were already consolidated in the manner they now actually are. Nevertheless, it by no means follows from hence that the transversal valleys have been gradually excavated by our present currents. Here causes much more powerful have been at work, for the transversal valleys, at their outlet from the Alps, are very deeply intersected, as is more especially rendered evident by the lakes which still exist, and which are found at the opening of many transversal valleys. Mr. Eshar is of opinion that the fractures which produce the transversal valleys of Switzerland were occasioned by the violent passage of the waters which originally filled the highest longitudinal valleys. He considers that revolution as identical with that which swept from the Alps those innumerable fragments of rocks now observable and which scattered them over the deep valleys, as well as on the sides of the chain of Jura opposite the Alps. He accounts for the disappearance of the rocky masses which once filled up the gaps by which the transversal valleys intersect the chains, by directing the attention to the enormous heaps of rolled pebbles which are found in all the longitudinal valleys, and along the whole line of the foot of the Alps, to which must be added the materials which fill up all the depths of the great valleys situated between the Alps and the Jura. Some of the valleys of the Alps, says Dodemier, have been excavated in the heart of those mountains by an abrasion as violent as it was active, a circumstance indicated by the correspondence of the banks and the sides in perspective, and which is ascertained, with regard to some of the valleys, descending from Montrose, by metallic veins which preserve their direction by appearing in the mountains opposite, notwithstanding the great solution of continuity. It is not assuredly the transient waters of Dr. Buckland's deluge which have produced those abrasions, nor which have detached the granite blocks from the needles of Chamouni. If mountains such as the Mont Blanc have been formed by elevation, or by what de Saussure terms refoulement as several able geologists imagine, it is not necessary to raise the waters of the deluge to the height of the loftiest mountains, in order to explain the transportation of the granite blocks. It is by no means probable that at the epoch of the deluge, the surface of the sea attained the high summits of the Alps, and in particular the basis of the Needles of Karauni, where we only just begin to find the chloritic granite, similar to that of which the blocks which lie on Mont Salève are composed. On the contrary, there are phenomena which indicate that at the period of the last retreat of the sea, its level was but little elevated. This would appear from those accumulations of marine exuvie belonging to the mollusca, which now lives only on the sea coast, and in shallows. Such are the accumulations constituting the beds of fossil shells of Piedmont, the states of Parma, and those in the vicinity of Paris. When these animals lived, the waters of the sea could not be of very great depth upon the plains of Europe. All the chains of mountains, and their upper valleys, were above the level of the sea. The fragments of petrified wood, and the bones of the large quadrupeds, such as the elephant and the rhinoceros, found with the beds of shells in Piedmont, in the states of Parma, and in the Val d'Arno, evidently show that there existed dry lands, in the neighborhood of the sea where those animals lived to which the shells belonged, and such lands could not be other than the valleys of the Alps, and those of the Apennines. We may, therefore, suppose that the sea was at that period raised only from 200 to 300 toises above its actual level. Its waters were consequently very far from reaching the basis of the Needles of Chamouni, whose height above the level of the ocean is from 12 to 1300 toises, or even the basis of the Needles in the Sea of Ice, which is less elevated. In reference, also, to the adoption, by the Reverend G.S. Faber, of Dr. Buckland's opinion, that the tracts of land which we now inhabit are the same as the antediluvian continents, Mr. J. Andre De Luc makes the following remarks. This opinion is not only subverted by the argument deduced from the total absence of human fossils from our strata, but there exist undeniable proofs of a long continuance of the ocean upon extensive portions of the present continents, immediately preceding the retreat of the waters from their surface. It is in vain that Mr. Faber seeks the site of paradise. The state of the earth is altogether changed. Mr. Faber observes, in his Origin of Pagan Idolatry, that the antediluvian mountains must have sunk very deep in order to lay bare such mountains as the Andes. Granting, however, that the Andes should always have had the height which they now have, a circumstance which admits of a doubt, it is not necessary to suppose that the waters of the ocean rose to their summit previously to the flood. They might have stood at a much lower level. Mr. Faber does not seem perfectly to understand the opinion of De Luc, when he says that the olive leaf could not have been plucked off by the dove from a tree that floated at the surface of the waters. De Luc conceives that the olive leaf was plucked off from a tree which grew on an island that had not been submerged. Mr. Faber is in error when he thinks that a continuance of 150 days at the bottom of the waters would not have destroyed the olive trees. 10 or 15 days would have sufficed for that purpose. Besides, the violent motion of the waters would have suffered nothing to subsist at the surface of the earth. All vegetation would have been destroyed, or swept away. In the general correctness of these observations, the editor cannot but concur. Long residence of the sea upon extensive portions of our continents immediately before the last revolution. That the sea rested for a considerable period of time on many portions of our present lands, previously to its retreat into the bed which it now occupies, has been satisfactorily shown by De Luc. It would appear from his repeated observations in various parts of our continents, that numerous and very extensive strata of quartzose sand, together with beds of clay, marl, and other materials were chemically precipitated from the waters of the sea, at a period immediately preceding the Great Revolution, and that it is by a continuation of its last precipitation, that we find its new bed covered with a great abundance of sand. Many of those strata which abound with marine bodies were evidently formed in the very places where they are now deposited and indicate a long residence of the sea. In Siberia, for example, fossil bones are frequently discovered in or beneath strata filled with shells. Thus, at a short distance from the river Iset, which discharges itself into the Tobol, there have been found, in a sandy bluish day, the bones of elephants black at the exterior, and in a decayed state, together with sharks' teeth. That bed of clay was covered by 8 different strata of the Mali yellow clay, sand, of which the 4 lowest were micaceous. Mr. J. Andre De Luc quotes the authority of Professor Pallas for this particular fact. He observes that the operations of the sea must have been of long continuance on that spot, after the elephant bones and the shark's teeth had been buried in the blue clay, and states his opinion that a great part of those bones must have been buried beneath the waters of the ocean a long time previously to the last revolution. Mr. Parkinson, in like manner, considers that the widely extended beds of sand and gravel so commonly occurring, with sandy clay, sometimes intermixed and sometimes interposed, were slowly deposited by the sea. It is further to be remarked that those beds, altogether extraneous to the stony strata on which they had been formed beneath the waters of the ocean, have suffered the same ruptures, dislocations, and partial subsidences as the stony strata. Referring, in his remarks on Kewan's geological essays, to the vast accumulations of shells found in loose and superficial soils, these shells, says De Luc, are found in regular strata of marl, argil, and different kinds of sand. In some places, those strata continue the same to the greatest depth we can reach. In others, their nature changes as we penetrate the soil, and then it most commonly happens that, after having met with a certain family of shells in a particular class of strata, we find different families in those either above or below, in the same manner as we observe the families to change in the stony strata, where they form whole mountains. Lastly, the loose strata, which are always parallel to each other, are in various places fractured and highly inclined together, as well as the stony strata which they cover. From these facts De Luc deduced the following important inferences: that while these shells directly prove our continents to have been formerly covered by the sea, it is no less evident that they could not have been deposited by the waters of the deluge, for, in that case, the utmost confusion would prevail throughout all the loose substances on the surface of our soils. Secondly, that these regularly disposed strata were produced from the last precipitations which took place in the sea, when marine animals existed at its bottom. And, thirdly, that the sea retired from our continents, by changing its bed. Some links of connection which subsist between the facts in geology that have here been noticed, and the Mosaic account of the deluge, will now be pointed out.